Debs, let's talk about activism because, geopolitics and the state of America, that's going to leave a filthy taste in our mouths.
Yeah, I mean, this is hardly cleansing the palate, but yeah, I thought it would be a good opportunity to talk about what's happening in Palestine and also what's happening with Palestine activism in the UK. Obviously, as you will know, Israel has restarted its genocide in Gaza. There's also been a big uptick in attacks in the West Bank, and things are looking extremely grim. Hundreds of people have been killed in Gaza, including, children being killed on Eid. Hundreds of thousands have been told again to evacuate parts of Gaza, and it's really difficult to see what is going to happen other than the mass expulsion of those people from that piece of land, especially with Trump in the White House. It's not that clearly not that Biden was any better. It's just that there was an election happening. So there was a sense of like, there might be some change in policy at some moment. And now that's clearly not going to be the case. And Trump is fully on board with the mass expulsion of people from that piece of land and turning it into some kind of Trump theme park.
You know,
Yeah. And then in the context of the UK, obviously, there's protest and activism happening all around the world in solidarity with Palestine. And in the UK, there's lots of different groups that have been doing things. And I wanted to talk about Youth Demand, who I think are really interesting because it's obviously young people. They're kind of taking some of the tactics that have been used by Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil, but their message is tying together climate change and Israeli genocide and apartheid, which I think is really powerful and really strong because criticisms have been made of groups like Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil for having this very single issue view of climate change. And so it's very powerful to start to see people, who have probably come out of those movements, really being able to see all the links between these different issues. And they are completely interlinked because they're completely interlinked by the kind of financial institutions, by the corporate institutions. It's very often the same banks that are funding Israel and funding settlements and funding, the arms trade, and that are also funding the fossil fuel industry. And I think being able to see, I mean, quite aside from the fact that, like, obviously the destruction of the homes of 2 million people is like an absolute carbon catastrophe. Like the kind of emissions that you see from a war zone are just absolutely astronomical. And so, yeah, to actually see what is happening in the genocide in Palestine as sort of something that people that care about climate change really need to be on board with, I think is just very important. So Youth Demand have been doing lots of different protests, and then they've made this plan to try and shut down London over April, which is, exactly the tactic that XR used in its first like big period of action. And they were having a meeting at the Quaker Meeting House in London last week, and the police broke down the door. They didn't even like ring the doorbells, it's like literally in the middle of the day. And like the people are just having a meeting, and they arrested a bunch of them there, and then they raided a whole bunch of other people's homes. And they've all been sort of released without charge but on bail. And so this is a very common tactic to kind of take the people that they think are organizers and say, you're now going to face much bigger consequences if you participate in anything. Anyway, if you want to join any of their actions, you can go on their website. I would say, they're running action trainings and legal briefings throughout this month. And I do think going to the legal briefings is really, really important because especially if you've come out, the climate of repression of protest is obviously mad. But even if you've come from environmental actions, if you're now for the first time coming and doing stuff around Palestine, you will probably be getting a worse response from the police. So it's really important that you know what your rights are, that you have a bust card, that you know what you would do in the case of being arrested. Also how to try and avoid being arrested. Getting arrested is really shit. Don't do that in a way that's non-intentional. But yeah, I think that there's obviously lots of other ways that you can participate in this movement to support Palestine as well. You can look up what the Palestine Solidarity Campaign is doing, look at what the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement are doing. Think about if you've got a pension, see if there's a divestment campaign for your pension to move its money. There's campaigns against Barclays, there's campaigns against Coca-Cola. You could go to your local shops and say, can you stop stocking Coca-Cola and instead stock Gaza Cola, this new brand that's come about that is, raising money to support people in Palestine. But yeah, it's obviously like such a vital issue and such an acute situation. But there are things that you can do about it if you kind of look up these organisations and try and get involved.
So just before I bring you in, Chivers, I had a couple of reflections. One was that I went to environmental meeting recently, and as an old environmental activist, I hadn't realised how little you can do nowadays in terms of protest. And it's really hard if you're not an activist to understand like how scary it is, how unnerving it is to realize that you can't do things that you thought were basic. Basically, coming together and spending time together. I mean, they really do want us alone in our rooms together. They shut down all the pubs and the clubs and don't spend time together. Don't do anything but be on your phone. We're going to shut down all the social centres and community centres, and there's nowhere to go on this rainy little island. And if you do ever want to come together to do anything political, we're going to arrest you before you do anything political for thinking about it, for talking about it with other people. You can think about it in your room, in your head, as a daydream. It's sometimes what it feels like. And particularly when the arrest organisers, the other thing I wanted to note is that in the bail conditions, that means they can come and search your house like whenever. And for instance, after this, they all went and raided everyone's houses at 2 a.m. And I know people who have been through this where you would get every week or so just raided at 3 a.m. because that's what they try to do to intimidate you. Having said all of that, it's still not legal to come together and do things about the world. And Debs has pointed out all of those things. I think one of the things that we're going to want to do is, referencing the last part, is to try and protect civil liberties as much as possible, our freedoms to be together and to do things. And these are now going to be not only fights for the campaigns themselves, but for our rights to be able to be together to make change. So we really need to dive into this. And as I say, start off by meeting together, talking about the news, what you're going to do about it, join these groups, look at the campaigns you can be part of, and then have chats with your local shops and things like that. Chivers, how did you find these stories, and particularly the terrible stories of what's happening in Palestine and Gaza?
Yeah, horrific, and it sort of contributes to the what we've talked about a lot on this show is that all-pervasive sense of just like everything is really, really horrible and getting worse all the time. And, a lot of the stuff that, different campaign groups and activist groups are doing to raise awareness of it is like fantastic and powerful and important, but also up against this like rising tide of things getting worse and worse and worse. Not to say that like protests can't do anything, but like it's just the current state of how things have been getting exponentially worse in Palestine, how the kind of repressive acts of the state here and in America have like really ramped up, especially in the last 6 months or so, as Deb said, now that the ceasefire came and went and now the genocide has come back with a vengeance. I think what stood out for me, and like from my own personal experience, is seeing like how in protests on Gaza and Palestine, how like a lot of these repressive movements by the government and the police here in the UK has really started to shift sort of general public perceptions and consciousness towards protest as like a basic mechanism of civic expression and communication and public participation. It was sort of, I think back to like a lot of the Extinction Rebellion protests where, it was people blocking roads or, getting up onto bridges or billboards to like block traffic and make a statement about this stuff, and how quickly a lot of the political and police response on that was geared very much in a way to like make ordinary people angry about the inconvenience of protests, and how these people were being very selfish and rude and like interrupting their everyday lives as a way to completely distract from the substance and the power and like the importance of the message that the protester was trying to get across. And I saw that. I mean, I was in town the other week, just sat in a cafe, and like for about 3 or 4 minutes there was a sort of a pro-Palestine, stop the war in Gaza kind of silent march protest. I think there was about 10 or 15 people. They may have been from the local university, walking through with placards saying free Gaza, end the genocide, stop UK support for Israel. A very sort of encouraging, inspiring, small act of protest by a local community group. And just in the sort of 5 or 10 minutes they were walking past the cafe, while I was like, that's really good to be happening, I should go and talk to them after, I saw about 10 random members of the public go up and start accosting these protesters. And I couldn't hear what they were saying because it was on the other side of a cafe, but just thinking, like, these surely aren't, like, rabid pro-Zionist, anti-Palestine, hate-filled warmongers. These are just sort of members of the general public who are seeing a protest and reacting in a way of, like, how dare you go out and express yourself? Who do you think you are? You know, interrupting my pleasant experience on the high street by walking through and wearing placards and, you know, shouting slogans. I think that's sort of one of the sort of corollary effects of all of this repression on the protests themselves is like a really substantial change in public attitudes and consciousness towards protest, where previously it was treated as like, you know, a sort of maybe a sort of nuisance or a thing to ignore, and maybe if you saw enough of them you'd start to pay attention to the message and wonder what is it these people are protesting about. The scale of the repression and the denigration of climate protesters and now Palestine protesters has, I think, had a real, like, substantive psychological impact on how the general public perceives us protest as a means of public communication. And that's kind of really worrying in the sense of, like, what can protest achieve when you're going out there to try and convince ordinary members of the public, to make them aware of what's going on, to try and raise their concerns and get them interested and concerned with you about it. Like, all of these efforts are seen to be just like to destroy the concept of protest as something that is completely legitimate and important in a democratic society.
And something that I forgot to mention in the first segment was about what dehumanization allows. We talked about it in a previous episode, and Debs, you brought it up about, like, when you dehumanize immigrants, and in this case dehumanize protesters, human beings become things. They become things rather than people, and things that you can feel any way you like because they don't deserve to be treated as another human being. You can feel any way you like, and you can act any way you like to them. You see people have tried to run at protesters over in their cars. You don't mind people who are immigrants or people who don't look like you being rounded up and detained by people without trial. You're glad. There's some joy in seeing these things, bad things, happen to these things, not these people, not these human beings that you can feel any emotion with. And that is so often when we are doing media activism and we're talking about, like, you can't dehumanize people, you shouldn't be talking about people as swarms or like as this and that, and using these pejorative, not just pejorative adjectives, but dehumanizing adjectives that creates this distance between us and other humans. When we're doing that, it often seems a bit like we're policing thought or speech or just something distant that doesn't really have a real world effect. This is the real world effect that we all are okay with, and some people are celebratory of attacks on people's right to protest. And whatever you feel about protest, and hopefully if you listen to this you're kind of for it, it's important because it's the only way that anything useful changes. Having said that, it's not the only, and we will keep talking about all the other ways that you can support those things: cooperatives, trade unions, community organizing, single issue campaigning, lobbying, etc. We're going to talk about all of those. Debs, any final thoughts on this before we talk about why Chivers hates adolescence?
I mean, I think it is also important not to overstate how positively people felt about protest, for example, in the 2000s. Yeah. But I do think that there's been a shift. I don't think protesters were seen as dangerous then. I think protesters were seen as irrelevant, annoying. You know, there was definitely a generally quite an apolitical culture. And then I think maybe there's been a period in between, maybe in the 20s, when protest was kind of cool. And now we've moved into a space where, protesters are seen as kind of dangerous. Yeah, people have definitely been very encouraged to interpret their sense of annoyance, inconvenience as symbolic of a wider kind of breakdown in morals. Yeah, that it's a sign that, you know, it's obviously there's definitely a generational side to it as well. Like, usually the people that I've been harangued by most have been quite old. And yeah, there's something about, but it is true that, for example, with this thing with the youth demand, it did seem to overstep. Like, I watched a clip from Talk TV, which is, you know, and the guy was like, well, I might not agree with what these young people wanted to do, but of course I think it's ridiculous that they would knock the door down of a house of worship to arrest these people. So yeah, I do think that this kind of preemptive arrest of meetings, of people who are doing things which are seen as quite respectable. And it is true that youth demand, everyone that I've seen speaking for them, it has seemed to be pretty middle class and white. So yeah, they're presenting a kind of respectable face of protest, and obviously it looks and feels differently when the people that they're arresting or that they're targeting are black and brown people who are also trying to assert their kind of rights to free speech.
Yeah, interestingly, and then we'll break the thing. I've noted a lot that actually, whilst there has been obviously there's this kind of fake protection of free speech from the right, they're also the only ones currently who are against some of the quite restrictive laws of, for instance, the Online Safety Act and other things, because some of the laws do overstep the bounds and do infringe on freedom of speech. And at the moment, what we have, I think this is a discussion for another time, is we're thinking about is that the left and liberals in particular have gone, well, fuck you guys because you're a bunch of knobs. There are people, we're seeing it today, someone has been given a custodial sentence for writing an aggressive email to a head teacher, right? Fuck. Like that, and clearly they were not a pleasant person and this was not a pleasant email. And so it's hard to feel any sympathy with them. But then it must be really hard if you're right wing to feel any sympathy for a pro-Palestinian protester. And we might have to recognize that we have given the state some extreme powers here. And even if it's being used against people that we think are pretty grotesque, we don't necessarily want them to end up in prison or being policed by the state. I'd rather shame them online, or whatever, or have a discussion with them and talk about why they're idiots, rather than like police coming around and locking a lot of these people up. So this will probably be an ongoing discussion for News Club, and I'm glad we've opened it up here.